Hello, and welcome back. I am going to give myself a challenge of finishing this engine within a week. That means fully completing everything needed for the intake and the EGR, dropping this into that Mustang, getting it running, and driving it down the road. Let's see if I can actually do it. But let's start with this intake, and I'll show you exactly what I did. So here is the intake. It is fully welded together. The way I started was I took this intake and took it to a buddy's shop that had a stand-up bandsaw, and I used that to cut this right in half. The bandsaw was a little bit old, so I kind of had a little bit of waviness to my cuts. So I used a belt sander to smooth up these edges, make them nice and flat. Then I brought it home. I bolted it up to the engine, and I started with this square piece here. I ground down these edges right here. This used to be a flat surface, but I kind of followed the line of the intake tube. Then I started with this square tubing right here, and this is what I actually cut from. I will put a link down in the description for where you can purchase this, the size and item on it. I cut out a little section, put it right in here, started welding along. The aluminum that was in the square tubing was melting significantly faster than the cast aluminum, so it was a little bit difficult to weld. For these pieces, I used 1/4 inch plate aluminum. I got that from the same website. And as you can see, these are the pieces that I cut out for this, the bottom, and the back side. When I first welded this together, the thing with aluminum, once you start welding and you do one full section, aluminum has really good thermal conductivity, and I knew that about aluminum already, but it's really a different experience if you've never welded aluminum before, actually feeling the heat throughout the piece. I mean, you start welding here, and you're going to feel that heat all the way back here. It's just absolutely crazy. But I welded this all together. This was a mistake. I did not actually stop to give it time to cool down. I just kept going, and as a lot of the welders know, if you do that, this thing is going to shrink. And that is exactly what it did. These bolt holes lined up, but the back ones were way in. So what I had to do was I actually had to cut this in half. Since this was good, I just heated it up a little bit and moved this thing back out. And what I did was I bolted this thing down and did not take it off of the engine the second time. Welded everything together. Again, didn't give it time to cool down. It shrunk on me again. So to try to compensate for that, the shrinking wasn't quite as bad, but the bolt holes that go to the heads, I did drill them out. They are bigger holes than stock. These ones right here are actually drilled all the way out to 1/2 inch. These two right here are smaller. I didn't have to drill these out quite so far. But with that second time of it shrinking again, being that the bolt holes were expanded, what I did was I took this thing and I cut it in half again, pushed it as far as I could, basically overcompensating because I knew it was going to shrink again. And somehow on the third try, letting it cool down and knowing that the shrinking was going to occur, this thing actually lined up perfectly. It's perfectly square, even with these giant holes in here. And the other thing is, the gaskets that come for a 4.6, they actually don't line up on these intake ports super well. So kind of having that play was a good thing because you can line it up to where the rubber is in the gasket. I'll show you that here in a second, what I'm talking about. Once I had this fully welded together, I had to modify this plate right here. This is an adapter plate for the Edelbrock Victor Jr. If you don't modify it, of course, these holes will fit on these ones that are in the casting. But what I had to do was I marked sections in here to where it would follow this piece that comes out. Took a center hole punch, put it right in the middle, hit a spot down, and I drilled through each of these holes. I lined this up to the aluminum intake and made my holes as well. These are not fully square, so it's only going to fit on here one way, but it did seem to work pretty well. I drilled into the intake, made threads for these bolts. These bolts are grade 10, I believe. I grabbed them from Ace Hardware. I have this bolted down. I used some of that universal gasket maker, the stuff where it's a roll, you unroll it, and then you have to cut out your piece for your gasket. And that seemed to work really, really well for this. So once I bolted everything down, the gasket, I don't see any air holes in here. Trying to get this square was extremely difficult because my belt sander is not big enough to fit this entire surface. So I was doing this by hand using one of those really long sanders that you would use for like body fill. I was just going in here, sanding along. I would say probably take it to a shop, use a belt sander for this because it makes it so much easier. But one thing with welding in here, it does get really tight. I was using a TIG welder, and aluminum is quite interesting actually. You're heating this up, and you've seen those YouTube videos or shorts or TikToks. You're going in here, they're not adding filler whatsoever, and it's basically melting together and forming your seam. That doesn't necessarily work on this because what was happening with me when I was doing that just to try to get a spot weld was it would look good, but once it was cooling, that seam would crack. So I had to start adding filler material to make it stop cracking. So I'm not 100% convinced that my welds are going to hold up because the welds cracked so many times when I was doing this. I believe I've got it to the point where the filler material is in place in every seam, and I don't think it will crack, but time will tell if it's actually going to crack or not. I kind of think it's going to, but fingers crossed it doesn't. As you can see right here, there are multiple beads in here. That is because I had to cut this thing so many times. And let me show you the back of this real quick. I'll get you a close-up on it. So as you can see right here, there are multiple lines in here with welding. Again, it's because I had to cut it so many times. This aluminum is probably very weak because I welded it so many times. One thing that I read was if you get aluminum really hot, it doesn't hold up quite as well as just a single bead. Something about letting it sit is supposed to make it stronger. I don't know how true that is, but hopefully this holds up. Again, not sure that it's going to, but let's try to get this 5.4 working in this Mustang and see how long this lasts. So here's the intake ports on one side. Again, you'll see multiple beads, a weld. But if you take your gasket and you put it on this thing, if I can get this oriented correctly, you'll see that it does fit fairly well, but the gasket comes over the edge. Let's get you a little bit closer look down here to see what's going on. I'm not sure if you can see that, but I mean, the gasket itself is this blue piece, but if you line that up, that blue piece barely goes on this aluminum. So it's going to be interesting trying to get this to seal properly. So this is the welder I was using. This is the cheapest Harbor Freight welder you can get. So there are better options out there, but on a budget, trying to do this fairly cheap, it seemed like this was a good way to go. Reviews said it was a decent do-it-yourself welder where you're not going to be using it a lot. I put this thing through 3 weekends of just absolute torture, and it held up to what I was doing. It is fully set up with 100% argon. This thing can go up to 200 amps. I only ever had it on 150 for that 1/4 inch plate aluminum, and it seemed to do really, really well. A couple of the reviews say the foot pedal is kind of cheap, which, yeah, it is. I mean, it's the cheapest Harbor Freight welder you can get for a TIG, at least. The connector, yes, cheap. The wire that's in the ground clamp, it did get burnt a little bit, so if you're going to use this every day, I'd probably say switch your ground clamp to something a little better than this, but for what I was using it for and how long, it was okay. I mean, 3 weekends, that's not terrible, you know. Everything that I read about aluminum welding is you want AC and you want your torch to be on the positive side. That is not an option on this welder. When you take the terminals off here and you switch them, if you try welding with it with AC, what's going to happen is you're going to burn up that tungsten on your torch. Ask me how I know. So I took this welder apart to see what was going on inside, and the argon is only going to the negative side, which it worked. It probably would have been better if it was on the positive side too, but so just be aware that if you're going to switch this to positive, it's not going to work because there's no argon going to that positive side unless you modify it. Then again, if you bought an extended warranty, that's probably going to void your warranty if you do that. So really up to you if you want to modify your welder. There are a couple reviews saying that the pressure regulator valve for this that comes with it are defective straight from the factory. That is true. I was using it. I had it set to 15 to 20. I don't remember what the unit of measurement is for that, but based on what I read, 15 to 20 is perfect for aluminum welding. But as I was welding along, that weld was being pushed away because there was so much argon coming through the torch. So once I replaced this is actually from Amazon. That pushing effect completely stopped when I was welding, and it went pretty smooth from there. The filler material that I was using is from Harbor Freight as well. It's the VULCAN ER 4043. And this seemed to work really well for filler material. One thing I did do before I actually started welding on that intake was I also grabbed an 1/8 inch plate aluminum from that same website. And I just started making beads, as you can see right here. These ones, based on what you read online, you want to start without having any filler material, and that's what I tried right here. And that's before I changed the regulator. So as I was welding this, it was just being pushed and creating a huge divot as I was going along. But once I started using filler material, that's when I could get this beaded effect going along the weld. So once I felt comfortable doing this a couple times, that's when I started going into the big stuff with the cast aluminum. So the things I learned starting off with this TIG welding, especially with aluminum, I know it's the hardest thing to weld, at least from what I've been told, is when you're first starting out, you kind of rush it more than you should. And also trying to adjust that foot pedal going along and regulating that voltage going to it. If the pedal's getting too hot, backing it off. If it's too cold, putting more into it. I found myself pushing on the pedal all the way and creating this giant puddle. And then I'm like, okay, wait. Slow down, back it off. Get it to the point where there's just this tiny little puddle, and then ease into it to make that puddle a little bit bigger, and then start adding your filler material into the puddle. Another thing that I found myself doing was when I was welding along, taking that filler material and accidentally touching that tip. And once you do that, you get that giant ball on the tip of your tungsten. Then you have to stop everything that you're doing, get out your grinder for giving that nice tip on your tungsten, and then you continue after that. I grabbed this from Amazon and works really well. I was using an angle grinder to try and get that tip, but it was just really difficult, and this tool right here made getting a tip on that tungsten super easy. So definitely recommend a tip grinder for your tungsten. The tungsten that came with this machine was gray in color. I don't remember the exact name of the gray, but based on research, gray means that it basically covers all your bases. You can do stainless, you can do steel, and aluminum. It'll pretty much do everything. But when I was looking into getting different colors, I went and grabbed the blue and white. Blue is essentially a better gray from my understanding, and the white is strictly for aluminum. The arc that you get from it is supposed to be much better than the gray and the blue when using it for aluminum, so that's why I grabbed that one. Using the white one made it a lot easier than the gray for some reason, probably because it's made for aluminum. So if you're going to use it for strictly aluminum, I'd probably tell you go with the white. If you're going to use it all around, probably go with the blue. So now that we've covered the intake and the welder a little bit and what I actually did, let's get into this thing and actually go into modifying that EGR tube. So I placed the intake on the engine. The tape is still down just to protect the spark plug holes, and the intake gasket is also in place just to place this in the correct location for modifying that EGR tube. I did go grab new hardware for the holes down in here. The reason for that is, since this is different, the old bolts will stick up higher and not actually bolt this all the way down, so I had to get new hardware. These are grade 10 bolts, so I'm going to put those in real quick. Now all the bolts are in place. They are still loose. Since I made the holes on the intake a little bit bigger, I can still move it side to side just a little bit. And with this movement, I can actually place it to the point where it's going to fit the gasket down here. So I'm going to align this real quick and screw all these screws down. With this fully bolted down, I'm going to grab the elbow and stick it right on this plate. Now, I kind of wish this Mustang on here looked a little bit better. Kind of smashed in here, but that's all right. And as you can see, I did place the bolts on the outside of this when I was marking them to drill. So this will fit in here and screw down. Now I'm going to grab the EGR tube that goes from this point down to the header. So based off of fitting that I tried a little bit earlier, this tube right here is really, really close. I did get a 5/4 EGR tube just in case to basically cut and weld into here. These tubes can be very hard to weld because you'll get a lot of material inside this tube and it'll block it off sometimes, and then you'll get EGR codes like crazy. I thought about doing an EGR delete on this, but I'm going to try to leave this as stock as possible, but yet put a 5/4 in it. So let's go ahead and put this in place. Okay, based on what I'm seeing here, the way this ran before is it ran kind of in behind the engine and then up to the EGR tube. This, it looks like I'm going to have to straighten out this bend right here and possibly this bend right here to fit into our EGR valve. So what I may end up doing, I'm going to grab the torch, heat this up a little bit, and see if I can bend it without cracking it. I hope I can. So let's see if I can actually do this. So the way I'm going to start is I'm going to use MAP gas. And I'm just going to heat this section up right here, seeing how hot I can get it. Hopefully somewhere near glowing, so I can just grab this and move it. Wearing gloves, just that way I get a little bit of heat protection. If this doesn't end up working, I'll move to acetylene, but I know I'm going to have to be very careful with that just because this metal can be very thin. So let's get started. All right, let's see if I can bend this. All right, so far so good. Try to heat it up again. I'm going to try to get into this section a little bit more, just so I don't bend this area right here. All right, go again. And it looks like we're getting a little bit of a bend right here. I'm going to try to take a hammer and smooth this out. All right, let's try to heat this up again, see if we can get a little bit more bend out of it. All right, try to bend it. I am getting a kink right here, so not sure I can do anything about the kink, but it should be good enough for who it's for. I am going to tap on the outsides just a hair, just to see if I can make this pop up a little bit. Maybe try to add a little bit of heat to it to do it. All right, that's looking pretty good. Not perfect, but it will work. So let's loosen this up. And see where we're sitting here. Looks like this section right here is good. This part right here, I need to pull it down to be able to push it into here. If I work this section right here just a little bit, and throughout the entire pipe I can get this bent down to the point where I can put it in this EGR valve. Alright, I'm going to try to bend this. You can kind of feel it giving, so I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to take off these rubber hoses just so I don't burn them up. Let's do a test fit real quick. And it looks like... Alright, let's take this heat shielding off all the way. Come on now, get off there. Thank you. I think the next spot that I'm going to heat up is going to be right here, but I'm also worried about the fuel rail that sits in here. So let's grab the fuel rail, see where it's sitting, and we're going to try to keep this away from it just so we don't cause any fires. So this is what I'm looking at right here. This fuel rail is returnless. There's only one feed line coming into this fuel rail, and since there's a bend right here, it looks like I don't actually have to expand this at all, which I was expecting I would have to. But if you stretch this out enough, it actually does clear the aluminum right here and fits between the two sides. The issues that I'm seeing are the mounting holes right here on the intake. They're right here. So I'm going to have to do something with this, modify this to fit in here somehow. But the first thing that I would like to worry about is finishing this EGR tube. It is currently sitting right here. Needs to go in there. The main harness itself comes up here, feeds the injectors, the coil packs, and then wraps around the front. That's normally the way the wiring harness works on most modulars. On this one, being a Mustang, I don't remember if there's one right here, but we'll find that out once we put it into the car. So let's continue with this, see if we can't make these bends to fit into that EGR valve. All right, that's looking good. Let's do a test fit. And really, it looks like I could bend this down to where this point is sitting right here. And I don't need all this extra. So what I may end up doing is cutting here, and welding this piece right here onto this one. So let's heat this up again right here and see if we can't bend that down some more. Right. Get this on here. Try to bend this again. So this is what I'm thinking. I cut out this section right here. I have it to the point where it is very close. I'm going to use the TIG welder for this to try to get that welded back together. If you look right here, there is a little bit of an air gap between the fuel rail and the EGR tube, but after I get this welded together, then I'm going to heat up this section right here, see if I can't move it a little bit away from this fuel rail. So this right here I welded with the TIG welder, and that is perfect. Still close, kind of an air gap, not really. I do need to move this out some, but look at this fitment back here. That is right where I wanted it, right on the back of the valve cover. So I did check airflow through here. I also looked at the inside of the tube here where the weld is, and it is all free and clear. So this should be good to go. I just have to take care of this now. So now I have a little bit of an air gap here. What I did was I put a pry bar right through here, put some pressure upwards, heated right here, and right in here. And just with that pressure, I was able to get this little bit of clearance right here. That should be sufficient. Now I'm going to take this heat wrapping, put it on here, and see if I can slip it over this and give a little bit of protection here, just so we don't heat up this fuel. Right, so here is the heat shielding. I was able to fit it over this little barb right here. Essentially, this stuff, if you compress it this way, it acts like a Chinese finger trap. If you pull it away, it gets shorter. Pull it together, it gets a little bit bigger, and you can fit it over this. These little thick cords right here are a little bit of a pain. You kind of have to grab it and pull it over this barb, but if you work at it enough, you will get it to this point. So now I have this fully installed. EGR tube is all set. Let's now move on to the fuel rail and getting these moved to right here. So what I did here was I removed the EGR tube just so I could remove the fuel rail. I took two injectors out because really the only ones you need are this one and that one, just to align this so you can match up the bolts. So what I'm thinking here, if you take a look down here, that bolt hole is way up there. So I think I'm going to have to make another hole a little bit lower. So after a bunch of fighting and welding, I finally got this to the point where it bolts up. You can see it doesn't move at all. Got the bolts underneath there. During the welding process, the rubber line that went between the two rails did melt, and I pulled it off. I cleaned up these barbs, and what I'm going to do tomorrow is I'm going to grab a hose to go between these two rails. So I'll show you the other side real quick. Right here, this side fought me way more than the other side for some reason. But anyway, it is on here. It's good to go. So I'm going to get some shut-eye for a couple hours, and I'll get back to this again tomorrow. All right, there we go. That should be good. Oh, good morning. I've done a couple things on this engine this morning, and come here. I'd like to show you the little things that I've done. So I moved over this hose right here. This was just a little plastic piece in here that this slips right over it. And I did go to the store last night and picked up this vinyl tube that goes from that rail to this one. I did double clamp it just in case this clamp doesn't seal all the way. Hopefully this one will take up the rest of the looseness that this one may have and completely seal that off, but we'll see once we plug that in. I did match up this intake with the other one, so I have the water port for our heater hose and a plug right here. I am guessing that may be for like, if you want to add boost or something, you could probably put a boost gauge on there. But these pieces came with this intake, so super easy to install those. This thing right here, our PCV heater, this one I was a little bit concerned I wouldn't be able to change over. But I was able to screw this one out of the other valve cover. All you do is just take a 21 millimeter, take it right here, turn it to the side, and it kind of just turns and pops out. And for a 5.4 valve cover, this just slips right into this little grommet, so this fits perfectly. I'm not worried about that coming out at all. Other things that I did here, the temperature sensor, just moved that from the old intake to the new one, and I put a plug in right here. So since I'm refreshed a little bit and can actually fully function, let's explain the welding on these fuel rails. When I was going to weld these pieces, the ones that I cut off right here and weld them underneath, there was something weird going on with the welder, and I don't know how to explain it except for maybe it was the coating. I had to turn up the darkness on my welding helmet all the way, because what this thing was doing is when it was welding along, it'd be really dark and hard to see, but then this super flash of light would come out of nowhere and stay for about 5-10 seconds. And even with the welding helmet on at full darkness, I was still getting those green spots. So not exactly sure what that was, but it is fully complete. So since we have this bolted up, I am not going to remove it again just because I don't want to mess with the bolt holes that I created for this. On this back side here where the fuel inlet comes in, I did cut off that ear on the top just because the barb that goes from this fuel rail to this one for this hose, it was touching. So being that I wasn't going to use that top hole again, just cut it off and give me clearance to be able to fit this nylon tube. You're probably asking me, why aren't you just using a 5.4 valve fuel rail? There's a couple reasons. So here I have a 5.4 valve fuel rail, and it would fit perfectly for the fuel injectors themselves, but there's a couple issues. This pressure sensor is not on the 5.4 valve. So you have your pressure regulator going to your return line, but on this Mustang, the pressure regulator is on the inlet. So the Mustang has a returnless style fuel rail. So only one line coming in. This one has two, one for feeding and another one to return to the tank. I could put a return line in this Mustang, but that's a lot of work that I really don't want to do to this. I just want to get it running. The other issues are the fuel inlet is on this side on the 4.6 Mustang. The 5.4 valve fuel rail, it's all on this side, so I would have to redirect where that fuel was going, and I don't really want to. That's just a bunch of extra work I don't want to do. So I modified the 4.6 valve fuel rail to fit this 5.4. Hopefully I have no leaks, fingers crossed, but we'll see once we get this thing hooked up. I could probably go outside right now, hook it up to the car, stick a battery on it, and see if it can hold pressure, but I have to do some other pressure tests and things once I get coolant in it and all of that. So if I have to take the intake off in the car, it's no big deal. These are fairly easy to take off. So I'm happy with the way it is right now. So I'm going to continue, and we should be very, very close to attempting to put this in the car. I can't think of anything else that I need to do. I am going to take this elbow off and the intake off. I'm not going to take this plate off or the fuel rails. Just going to leave them in place. and use the bolt holes for where the intake goes to lift this thing up, just like how we removed it. Let's get started with removing this. Taking the intake off. I am going to put spark plugs in before I put it into the car. I'll see you again when we're ready to put this engine in the car.